You're listening to The Range, Gardner-Webb University streaming and on-demand radio. Jeff Powell in the studio with you. Joining me in the studio, Dr. Carey from the Communication Studies and New Media Department, chair of the department and instructor in the program as well. Welcome, Dr. Carey.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, it's been a while. Glad to have you back. Talking about a very timely subject coming up as we sat down to record this in just a couple of days. President Trump will become president number 46, I think it is. And there's been a lot of talk in the media about Trump and the media. His relationship with the media is a bit rocky, but at the same time, he dominates the news cycle and has figured out ways to do so. Particularly, I'm thinking of his use of social media. Of course, I'm talking in part, at least, about his use of Twitter, etc. So with that in mind, I thought it'd be great to have you in here to talk about the relationship between the president and the media. How far back do you want to start with this?
Oh, boy. We can look at the fireside chats.
Yeah.
That was kind of a unique situation and was really maybe I think the most dominant move to reach out to the general public and the people, and using radio as a natural way to draw attention, to solidify the importance of the presidency, the policies that were going on, the changes that were trying to be done, the politics that were involved, a lot of politics involved during that time. And people listened to the radio, and he used that to his strong advantage. I mean, that was the radio era.
Yeah, that's what I think is so important when you think about FDR and his use of what was then new technologies to get his message out. And he did it in a new and powerful way through as you say, the fireside chats and also through newsreels.
Yes, absolutely. He throughout time we have different changes in technology and how general users modify, but it's very interesting to look at the presidents and how they've utilized it in their presidency. And it's a challenge sometimes because these new technologies come along, and I think that's what we're seeing right now with Trump.
Yeah.
He's utilizing a very good social media, whether you agree with him or not. He's very effective at it, and he moves people left and right. You watch the stock markets move left and right with him, up and down, tweet, really.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. His approval rating goes up and down with tweets. And it's a very unique use there. We talked about FDR and the radio and the newsreels, and then probably the first real television president was John F. Kennedy.
I think Kennedy said after that very, very close election against Richard Nixon, when there wasn't really a lot that divided them on the issues, that why do you think you squeaked by and won this election? He says TV. It was those first televised presidential debates.
Absolutely. And, he was very conscious of what he looked like on television. Nixon was not. Nixon had that 5 o'clock shadow because he was in the evening and he looked a little rough, and that was just that turned a lot of people off. Yeah. And I think you're absolutely right. It was a very close election, and in the sense that they weren't that far apart politically, and there were a lot of things going on, and I think Kennedy recognized the importance of television and the way you look.
I'm reminded of some reports at the time that came out that said if people only listened to the debate on the radio, they thought Nixon won, but everybody that watched it on TV said no, Kennedy won.
Exactly.
So Kennedy and that whole kind of Camelot image, as it would become known, he knew how to play to the camera.
Oh, absolutely. His posture, the way he reacted, Nixon had no clue. I mean, he was very, very different and very stoic and just did not come across on camera. I mean, it even continued into his presidency. I mean, let's face it, part of that's his personality.
Yeah.
And you're right. I think if Nixon had functioned in just a radio age and we were only listening to audio, he probably would come across much better than he does in television and in pictures. He comes across much stiffer.
Another thing that I'm reminded of thinking back to Kennedy is his use of the White House photographer to get images out there, to capture images that would help build his legacy once he was assassinated.
Yeah. He really utilized the presidential photographer and gave them insights and inroads into his presidency. He was allowed to travel, to be in the Oval Office, to have access that had not really happened before. It happened a little bit, but not nearly to the extent there. I think about the picture of John under the desk, and that humanized him. And that was a very real different, and it set the tone for later presidencies and the way they treated their photographers. Well, in actuality, Kennedy's photographer, when he was assassinated, was traveling in Dallas and recognized the importance of the swearing-in ceremony on the plane of LBJ. And LBJ's aides did not want any pictures of it. They felt like it was too traumatizing. And the photographer recognized, yes, that's important, and actually backed some people back up out of the way, shot the picture. And, of course, that becomes a very iconic picture because you not only have LBJ being sworn in, but you have a very shocked Jackie Kennedy, even with the blood on her dress still. And that image was very, very important at the time. And historically, it really set the tone for what happens. Every president since then has pretty well had what we call tight pool. And there are about 5 photographers and a couple of videographers that go everywhere the president goes. They're given public access. Now, when he has private meetings, they're denied that, except for the presidential photographer. But they traveled that way, and one of the major reasons is if an assassination attempt happens or an assassination happens, anything like that. When Reagan was shot, there were photographers right there. They were covering him, getting in and out
Basically,
of the limo.
Coming out of a building and getting in a car. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's what happens. I've actually been in tight pool and several times when Clinton was president, and it's pretty interesting. There's, you get to travel. You travel in the motorcade, and you have your own little van, and you're not very important, but they do give you a little bit of things. But it's that coverage, and that press coverage is important. And presidents recognize that interacting with the photographers and videographers was important. That's why they allowed the pool to happen, the tight pool. Whether President Trump is going to continue with that, I don't know. That's going to be an interesting thing. It's his call. I mean, it really is his call. So,
when do they normally make that sort of decision as to who's going to be the White House photographer? I know outgoing President Obama made that call very, very early on with a photographer he'd worked for back in his Senate days.
Right.
And he just brought him right in. Yeah.
Yeah. Pete had been covering him during the campaign, and it was natural flow. And in fact, it was, I don't think anybody was surprised at that. A lot of times it goes a couple weeks before they name it. Nobody in my circles, and I'm very active in the photojournalism circles, knows who's going to be President Trump's photographer, and or even Vice President Pence's photographer. And the vice president also has a photographer, and they have a staff, and as far as I've seen, I've not seen any indications as to who either one of them is going to name.
Interesting.
And there may not be a presidential photographer, and that's not. It's happened before. When Carter became president, he actually offered it to one person who turned it down, and he said, "Okay, I don't need a photographer."
Oh, that's interesting.
And went the entire president's career or time without a presidential photographer.
An interesting thing about that, when you mentioned Carter, was the idea that Carter brought back FDR's fireside chats, but this time on television.
Yes, yes.
Energy crisis, crisis in the Middle East, et cetera. And he addressed us in kind of a relaxed fireside chat style on television.
Yeah, and it's really kind of interesting because he had this persona of being very relaxed, and what I've read is the people who were dealing with him in communication said it was going to be a very closed personal side, and that's one of the reasons why the guy who it was offered to turned it down. He said, "I don't think I'm going to have the access into the personal life that I had," and that comes, LBJ hired a guy, and his photographer had total access. In fact, he had the ability to walk into the Oval Office at any time of the day unannounced, and that's just unheard of. He could just walk in the door and take pictures. There's pictures of LBJ in bed holding meetings on the phone. Him howling with his dog. All sorts of things, and that was unheard of. And so LBJ had that. Then Jimmy Carter has nobody. And we see Gerald Ford, when he took over from Nixon, had a photographer that had a lot of access. Now, he had actually been his vice presidential photographer, and he moved right into that office and gave him quite a bit of reign. The Bushes, both Bushes were pretty open with their photographers, and Clinton was somewhat open, more so obviously than Carter, but he was a little more reserved.
Okay.
And then Obama has been very open. Pete Souza is a friend of mine. He's had, for the last 8 years, he's had everything. Now, the interesting thing about that, and we talk about the relationship with the press has some pushback to Pete, because what has happened is in the Obama era, the White House controls the images. And what the tight pool would traditionally would have covered, they've been excluded, and they only allow Pete there, and then he will send out images. Now Pete stepped it up. He's used that social media. We talked about Trump and Twitter. They started using Instagram. They started an Instagram account, and Pete posts to Instagram all the time. And then that runs to Twitter, and it runs the whole realm. But they've controlled the image. They've controlled the availability. And quite honestly, President Obama has been less available to the general press as far as one-on-ones and following what's going on in meetings than probably just about any other president since Carter.
That's really interesting. You got all these photographs, but they are tightly controlled.
Yes.
And what the public sees is highly selected.
And a lot of newspapers, online services, and so forth actually won't use them because they consider them PR handouts.
Yeah.
And that's their problem with it.
Very interesting.
And Pete's an excellent photojournalist. And
I've seen some of his photographs.
Yeah.
They're very good.
Oh yeah. And he's a photojournalist, but he also realizes that his boss wants him to control the image.
Am I correct that Pete was was the White House photographer for an earlier president as well?
Yes, he was.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
To get to do it was Reagan, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
And he gets to do it twice.
Yeah.
That's
So, and he also did a Republican and a Democrat.
Yeah.
So that's kind of interesting.
It is interesting.
There's a couple guys that have done that, who've done multiple stints, and that's kind of interesting. like I said, nobody knows what Donald Trump's going to do. The latest flap has been there's talk about them closing the press room in the White House.
Yeah, I've heard that.
That's actually happened before too.
Oh,
really? The most recent time was when they were remodeling, and that's a quote remodeling.
Air quotes.
Yes. And the press was moved out into the executive building and weren't allowed in the White House for a while. Now, it eventually reopened, but or they were brought back in. But, yeah, they were moved out once before. And so that's not unprecedented. But this one will be a little tougher because, there's been some pushback from the transition team saying they don't want the press. They consider the press the enemy, and that's a unique piece. And I think that's going to play a very interesting role because the press really is what's called the fourth estate or the fourth branch of government, even though it's not official. They're there to make sure that the three branches of government are operating correctly. And that's part of where our country was founded. And so, it's going to be interesting to see how that plays between some of the media. And of course, the mainstream media, love them or hate them, they've been there, and there's a lot of niche market news media now, and they're actually growing. In fact, there are more of them who have press credentials for the Senate than mainstream media.
I understand that Trump is, or his transition team is talking about opening up for those White House briefings, whether they take place in the White House or not, just to be determined, opening it up to more of the new or non-traditional media to have access to those meetings as well. Because he's been very friendly with some of the people in the non-traditional media field. I'm thinking of Breitbart in particular.
Yes. Yeah. It is in some ways the alt-right.
Yeah. Breitbart certainly is.
It's interesting because that is one of the reasons they have given for possibly closing the press center in the White House, is because they want to expand that and make it available for more people. It is a very tight area. There's only room for about 49, I think, people. So it's pretty tightly controlled, and it eliminates some space for some of those people who would love to be covering it. So I'm not sure what's going to happen. That's going to be a really interesting turnout. It may expand and let the niche people really have a much more say in coverage, and that's going to be an interesting piece.
Well, if you think back to the campaign and all the rallies, and even after the campaign, even after the election, when Donald Trump took his sort of victory lap and did these rallies across the country, I mean, he very much called out by name reporters and insulted particular mainstream news media outlets, and I don't want to say he threatened violence, but he often talked about how some people might want to commit violence against these people because of what they were reporting. That's to me seems pretty unprecedented. That sort of adversarial relationship.
There have been presidents that have had adversarial relationships. Whether it's to this extent, I don't know. I don't think it's really been quite that forceful. One of the things in talking with friends who were covering Trump during the campaign especially, they would put them in a corral, and it wasn't necessarily the best place. And some of the photojournalists were like complaining that just people could walk in and take pictures and be closer than they were, and that they were jostled and threatened verbally by people who would walk by, and it's kind of interesting because there were a lot of I think there were a lot of mainstream media who saw the election coming, some of the results. I remember listening to some of them and how they saw the blue collar working class in some states actually responding. And one of the guys, I think from CBS, mentioned that he had been to a rally, and the rally had only been put together within the last 24 hours, and there were close to 10,000 people there.
Yeah.
In a day. And he said the majority of them waited in line 2 to 3 hours to get in. And that's unprecedented. That really is unprecedented. So this is going to be a unique time. How President Trump handles the media will be interesting. I don't think we're going to see as necessarily a wide open presidency. I think it's going to be a little more controlled. I think, traditionally, media flies on Air Force One. They have to pay for it. They have to pay their way. They pay expenses. There has been talk about not allowing them on Air Force One, and then what happens is there's a plane that follows that generally carries the majority of the press, and some are let on. So it's going to be interesting to see whether his administration allows those people to get on board Air Force One and be brought in, and who he allows. Like you said, Breitbart may be flying Air Force One.
All right.
So that's going to be a little interesting.
Well, during the transition phase, I believe that the Trump transition team, or Donald Trump for that matter, had one full-fledged press conference. And that's it. And I think Obama, in the transition period when he first won an election, had maybe 12 or 13 press conferences in the same period of time. So, yeah, we are seeing kind of a different idea here. But we're also seeing, and we hinted on this earlier, but want to bring the conversation to this point, that Donald Trump is using very effectively, he won the election, social media, particularly Twitter,
Absolutely.
In a way that he can kind of dominate the news cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. He's figured that out. When it comes to social media, he does understand how that works. Like it or not, whether you agree with him or not, he dominates it and does understand that what he can do, whether it's incendiary or complimentary, and those are probably fewer, but he can spike interest, and it will roll for days based on one tweet.
Yeah.
It's not been uncommon to see a tweet come out and in the news cycle be talked about for 3 news cycles.
Yeah.
And he hasn't put out another tweet.
Right. That's pretty amazing. Right
Yeah,
there.
it really is. It really is.
One thing I think I've noticed as well is the ability to, if a question arises, the press is asking a particular question of Trump or the transition team, and he doesn't necessarily want to respond or answer it, he can deflect attention by putting out one of these incendiary tweets, and suddenly the news cycle changes.
Yes. He's good at. Some people have called him the Teflon man because of that, because he deflects. It doesn't seem to stick.
Right.
We've seen all sorts of charges and negative things, and it doesn't seem to affect his popularity. Now, it is interesting that his approval rating is the lowest of any president in modern day times.
Right.
But we've seen that. We've seen that before.
Yes. I believe I read somewhere that, for instance, when Abraham Lincoln became president, they didn't have polls, but he became president with something like 37% of the vote.
Yes.
So,
and Lincoln was not a popular president.
Exactly. As a matter of fact, I understand, I just heard this, some news source today, that they really brought in the military for his inauguration event. There was a lot of concern that there might be violence.
Yes. That's absolutely right.
So yeah, we've seen unpopular presidents taking office before,
and we've seen a lot of dissension between outgoing and incoming presidents.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when Andrew Jackson was inaugurated, you know, there was no love lost there.
Right. They didn't show up.
No, no, they didn't.
Yeah.
You know, so a lot of people not showing up is
That's not new.
Not
Mm-hmm.
new.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be a little bigger
Mm-hmm.
than possibly in past. And the protests, that's nothing new either.
Yeah.
We've seen that.
And
Maybe not
2000.
to the scale, but you know, again, Donald Trump has the ability to polarize and dominate that news information. And I'm not so sure that he's as concerned about what he tweets.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's interesting. I think that what he's going to be like as a president is maybe going to be a little different than his tweets. His tweets are going to be kind of throwing out, testing the water, and see what see what comes back.
Yeah, you know, one thing that I'm thinking of here, maybe a nice place to take this conversation and to conclude this conversation is this whole idea of traditional news media now, all these non-traditional citizen journalism, etc. Fake news, and it appears to me, and then you can comment. It appears to me that what we're seeing is anything candidate or office holder X doesn't like is now fake news, whether it really is or not. And
That's true.
that term is being thrown around an awful lot. So let's talk a little bit about how we as citizens handle all the stuff coming at us in this era of what's real and what isn't.
Yeah, and you know, I tell my students there's fake news on both sides, both on the right
Yes.
and the left,
Mm-hmm.
and you have to discern that. You have to have some idea of what's going on. You have to look at your facts.
Just because it's on Facebook doesn't mean it's true.
That's absolutely true. You know, the old journalistic point was, I don't care if my mother told me that, I'm fact checking it.
Yeah.
You know, I'm going to look at that, and we have that, and it's not that it's been any. Quite honestly, there's been fake news for lots of time. I mean, it's very interesting. This morning, I was in my communication theory class, and we were talking actually about some of this, and the fact that there was fake news before it hit Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
All you had to do was go to a checkout in any grocery store, and there it was. Baby has 3 heads.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And you know, a lot of it was for humor. A lot of it was, you know, grabbing attention. There were lies that were put out about people, you know, that were totally untrue. It was totally fake.
Mm-hmm.
The difference is it's just moved to the internet.
Yeah.
And it's available to more people. And because more people are using social media and the internet, it's just more visible.
Yeah.
I'm not convinced that there's been this new cottage industry of fake news.
Yeah.
I think it's been here all along.
I'm thinking back to the era of yellow journalism.
Oh,
that
absolutely.
Made up stuff out of whole cloth. I mean, so.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, that's absolutely nothing new. You know, it didn't just happen this election cycle.
Yeah.
And it's happened in other election cycles. The problem is Facebook's news feed allows us to see that. And I realize that, you know, for the younger generation, Facebook is a dead and ancient, archaic
Yeah.
social media.
Yeah.
You know, but on Twitter and, you know, Instagram, other, you know, Snapchat, there's fake news. You know, I mean, Snapchat's a little tougher, but you can do it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Twitter, you've got so many characters to work with, but you can do it.
Yeah.
And it becomes fake news. And so it becomes just there, and we see it. And hopefully that people will begin to look at it and go, okay, is this really real? One of the things that I've noticed is the real fake news that hits all of a sudden, that seems to really hit, is actually maybe a month old. You know, it's some of the stuff that becomes that, especially in the last month of the campaign, I really noticed that there were a bunch of things that were hitting that were actually old news. I mean, they were old pieces, and some of it was partially real, but was old, and you know, it was done and gone, and
then it gets recycled, and there it is again.
Exactly, and it sometimes gets out there, and I remember reading one time on Facebook, somebody posted, "I can't believe that Donald Trump did this." Okay, just did this. Well, it was 6 months old. The story was 6 months old, and in that particular case, the story had been proven that he didn't do it. You know, which was interesting. You know, and vice versa. I mean, you know, so there's a responsibility, I think, for readers to look at their sources.
Check your source.
Check your sources, and unfortunately, whether you look at mainstream media, whether you look at niche media, you got to look at your source and realize that there's a gatekeeping process.
And I think that's the thing. Back when you had ABC, CBS, and NBC, and some radio networks, they had things in place to fact check, to have 2-3 sources before they go live with a story. In the era that we're in now with the internet, with social media, it's put out there. Nobody's,
absolutely,
not that nobody's fact checking, but again, what is the source? Is that a trusted source? Do you think that they're kind of peer reviewed? Are they looking at these things before they go live with them?
Yeah. I mean, the gatekeeping system is somewhat non-existent. You know, and the other thing is, you know, because of the changes in technology, anybody can be a journalist.
Yeah, citizen journalism.
You know, it used to be, if you wanted to produce a newspaper, it'd cost you $10 million to start up, because you'd have to buy the presses, the paper, and hire people,
hire
and
reporters,
everything. You know, today you can go and really you can get a WordPress blog site. You can get on at a internet cafe and, you know,
write a story.
Exactly. I mean, that's there is no gatekeeping, and what you or I just decide to post on a blog, who fact checks that? You know, and that was, as you said, when there were 3 major news channels, and that was it. There was no cable. There was just over-the-air broadcast. We had fact checkers, and we had that, and you never went to take a story out until you checked it and had verifiable sources. In the newspaper industry, it was always, you had to have 2 independent sources before we could go with it. If you didn't have that, wasn't running.
It's not a story. Well, it's a fascinating conversation, and it is a changing media landscape. And it's very interesting to think about how presidents in the past have dealt with the changes in the media landscape, and to kind of project forward what's going on now, what might be coming down the road with a new president.
Absolutely.
Dr. Carey from the Communication Studies and New Media Department here at Gardner-Webb University. If you have any questions or comments, just contact us here at the station, and we'll pass them along. Info@WGWG.org.